Armenia's central bank has just introduced a radical new way of doing monetary policy that focuses on scenario analysis rather than just a single expectation about the future of the economy. Now, I think this is really timely given that after the big COVID inflation spike, central banks have been scrambling to protect their reputation as they fail to communicate properly how big shocks can impact inflation and how these interact with more permanent inflation drivers like increased government spending, for example. However, given that a small open economy like Armenia has long had to deal with big economic shocks, they had already been working on developing a framework, the Forecasting and Policy Analysis System, or FPAS for short, that makes their monetary policy predictable while still making it clear how uncertain the future really is. To do this, they introduced an updated FPAS system, FPAS Mark II, and this system, like its predecessors, collects data, which feeds then into models and expert analysis, which then leads to a decision about the current and future interest rates, which is then communicated to the public. However, now, rather than communicating the single most likely scenario that led to their decision, they will communicate at least two scenarios about the future of Armenia's economy. This presents such a radical departure from the past, where central bankers have presented themselves perhaps too much as expert forecasters, that I figured, hey, I need to call Central Bank Governor Martin Galstyan and Deputy Governor Armen Nurbekyan to talk about how the history of central banking in Armenia led them to adopting a systematic approach to monetary policy, how this then led them to adopt this new scenario-based approach, how that then differs from what other central banks do, and finally, what scenarios the governors are now considering for the future of Armenia's economy. An economy that could potentially be one of the most turbulent in the world, with its reliance on geopolitical rivals Europe and Russia, while also being faced with armed conflict with its neighbor Azerbaijan, which is being supported by its other neighbor Turkey. So, without further ado, here's my in-depth conversation with Governor Martin Galstyan and Deputy Governor Armen Nurbekyan. Welcome, Martin and Armen. I'm very happy that you were willing to talk to me about how central banks set interest rates, and then specifically, of course, from the perspective of you guys from the Central Bank of Armenia. So I figured, maybe I can start by asking you, can you tell us a little bit about the history of the Central Bank of Armenia? Because I don't think many people actually know much about the history of monetary policy in Armenia. And so by that, I mean like monetary policy, I mean setting the interest rate, or at least, controlling money, inflation, GDP, and all of that in Armenia. So can you maybe tell me a little bit about that to start?
Okay, thank you very much, Joeri, for the question. I think the Central Bank of Armenia is not much different from many other central banks around the world. So after the breakup of Soviet Union, we just start pursuing the economic stability policy. And then we were mandated with running a diligent monetary policy as an independent institution. So since inception, we had that in mind, helping to provide good foundations and sound macroeconomic policy through very diligent monetary policy making. I think another kind of step that we made was 2006, which was kind of critical because we moved from monetary targeting to inflation targeting. And that's where we started contemplating with the idea of creating this framework, or somehow introducing the framework, which others have been doing for several years before us, which we called Forecasting and Policy Analysis System. And that's where our kind of analytical journey started. And then January this year, we introduced kind of a new layer of more complicated, more in-depth approach to that, which we called FPAS Mark II. And then this is probably the deepest commitment that we are going to give, not only to ourselves, but also to our general public, because in this type of setting, we're working with no linearities, very different type of models and so on. But at the same time, the level of our outreach and the level of communication is completely different. So we will be building our stories based on scenario analysis. And then we will be communicating with our general public and professional audience in a very different way, in a much more transparent and much more professional way. Probably that's in a nutshell.
All right. Well, that sounds very interesting, but I think there's quite a lot of things to unpack there. Because when you got independent, did it also mean that you then had to set up your own currency from scratch?
So we were the first country in post-Soviet Union to move to national currency. It happened so that all former Soviet or Russian rubles, I don't even remember where it were, like Soviet rubles or Russian Republic rubles. But because we were part of that ruble zone, everyone else, whatever they left behind, was transferred to Armenia. And you can imagine what kind of havoc it was creating in Armenia. And then we had a hyperinflation.
Yeah.
November
in the 90s, right?
1993, I think we introduced our own currency, and then we introduced our monetary policy kind of framework, and then we start working from scratch.
And then, because you mentioned that in 2006 you transitioned from targeting money to targeting inflation, I think, right? So can you explain a little bit, like, how did targeting money work? Like, what did that mean? Like, I think now a lot of people know what targeting inflation means. It means, oh, we want to have a 2% or a 4% inflation rate. But you mentioned before that you were doing something different. Well, what was that? How did that work?
I think general belief at the time was that there is a strict correlation between monetary aggregates and inflation. And then
the money supply and inflation.
Money supply
right?
and that type of things, right? And then if you are able to control money supply, and then in terms of if economy is overheated, somehow you are reducing money supply. If there is a problem of excess demand, you are reducing it. If there is a problem with less demand, you are kind of supporting it by pumping more money into the system. And that's how it worked. Basically, we were using our open market operations, being it repo, reverse repo, buying and selling government securities, to provide the level of monetary aggregate that we were targeting.
So that is expanding and decreasing the balance sheet of the central bank.
Right.
In other words, what I think a lot of people in sort of popular media would refer to as money printing or money decreasing. Right. That's what you used to do, and then you moved
monetary base, and then monetary base was converted into money supply with a banking system coming in through our instruments. And then at one point in time, we realized that there is no this type of correlation that we would expect. And like increasing or decreasing monetary aggregates wouldn't help much fighting inflation, because there are many other things in play. And that's why we entered the zone where we're trying to convince economic agents that whatever we promise on inflation target, we're going to deliver. So that's a very different type of a game. And that's built upon confidence that the central bank will provide the target that it promised.
Yeah, so, okay, you started with this money supply target, but it didn't really work. It's how I'm getting it from you. And that's, of course, not for Armenia itself. That was a general movement across all central banks, right? And then you move towards this new regime of using the interest rate to... But I still think a lot of economists still then think this has a relationship to money creation by private banks, right?
Right.
And then your target really officially became like, okay, our target is actually inflation, and these economic agents you're talking about is banks and people as well, and then that helped them to increase or decrease their spending and lending. Based on knowing actually what you want, right? Like, oh, inflation, we want it at 4%, I think was your target at the time. And if it's too high, they know, hey, okay, the interest rate's going up. Or if it's too low, the interest rate's going down. And that's maybe becomes sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Is that how I should see that in a nutshell?
I think you're working with incredibly difficult things, which are inflation expectations now. And then you are trying to get into the zone where we are trying to somehow work with people's psyche. And then that is more difficult than just working with monetary aggregates themselves. So what is important there is that you are trying to build your credibility, and by providing what you have promised. That's how it worked, basically. And then there are many things on a technical side, but I don't want to touch them, is like unobservables, like output gap, neutral interest rate, that type of phenomenon that we didn't work before. But conceptually, we were promising and we are promising something that we're going to deliver. And then people looking at our work and the job that we're doing at the central bank can assess whether we're credible in our promise or not. And then they can kind of project what central bank interest rate path would look like. And then if they believe what in the narrative and the story that we're telling, then we can somehow reduce the uncertainty in the system.
So in 2006, the job of a central banker became much more difficult, although much more successful, given that inflation became much more stable from then on. But much more difficult is what you're saying in the sense that you are now becoming a small, maybe no, not a small, but an actor trying to convince all of these different actors in the economy to change their behavior based on what inflation is doing. And so essentially, going back to sort of our topic, that is, how does the central bank set the interest rate? Do I understand it correctly that actually, that's not the correct way to think about it? Like the central bank doesn't just set the interest rate.
Right.
The central bank sets the interest rate today, but maybe even more importantly, tries to convince people what the interest rate will do in the future.
Yes, interest rate path would be a very solid and profound instrument nowadays. And then by setting interest rates or trying to make a decision, we are basing our decisions on economic conditions, inflation rates, economic output numbers, whatever is there, external factors. But in this new approach, which we called FPAS Mark II, we're trying to incorporate scenario-based analysis, and we're trying to do monetary policy as a risk management exercise. So we're not trying to be the expert forecaster, but we're trying to produce output in a way in terms of scenarios that would tell others how we think. And then in every one of our scenarios, we're telling them the convincing story that will bring the inflation back to target, or our inflation promise is a promise. But at the same time, they have a nuanced understanding of how we think and what occupies our mind at the time.
So before getting into FPAS Mark II, which is very interesting and we'll definitely talk about a lot, and it stands for, if I correctly believe it, FPAS is Forecasting and Policy Analysis Framework.
System, yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Excellent. But of course, you adopted this forecasting and policy analysis system, Mark I, so to say, first in 2006. But not all central banks have this, right? So can you tell me a little bit more about and we'll get to FPAS Mark II, I promise, but about how such a system itself even works? Like, why do you need that? What does it even mean to have a system like that rather than just to look at inflation maybe and set an interest rate?
Okay, so I think if what we had in mind by introducing this framework and kind of borrowing it, because it was not our invention, but we tried to borrow and implement it in our own central bank. I think the critical aspect of that is have a systematic approach to monetary policy making. So first of all, to have a proper framework in place, which would address several questions, including where is the economy now, how are we doing, and what kind of instruments do we need to bring our promise into reality. So by trying analytically to answer those questions, systematically creates a framework that was implemented by us, and that's why we call it Forecasting and Policy Analysis System. So there is a family of models which will try to help you in your decision-making process. But at the same time, what we think is very important is that we have a very systematic approach to inflation targeting. So that is the whole setup.
So how does that work? Because you're the governor, right? So you are very important in making the eventual decision about how to set the interest rate and how to communicate, in the future we're probably going to set these types of interest rates or this path. But you mentioned you're looking at certain variables in the economy all the time, right? That's that's the systematic part, in the sense that you're always looking at all of these variables all the time, or your staff is, I hope, given that you need some, you can't do all of this yourself, right? And then you mentioned that you use models, but in like, how do I look at it? It's like, okay, so your staff is looking at all of these variables, the data, I guess, right? And then they feed it into the models, and then they tell the model output to you, or does there happen, is there more going on than just the model?
I think Armen could jump in, but I'll make some points and then
Yeah.
we'll move from there. I think the most important thing is that we do have an agreement in the central bank that we never use the phrase model says. It's not the model which says, it's the people, staff who come with their own narrative based on the models that they run. So they come with their, at that time when we were having FPAS Mark 1, we're working with baseline scenario. So we're trying to fit entire complexity of the world into this one line, which would be the most probable. And that would tell you one story, which is, though we think that most probable, but that would help you to make a decision on interest rate. From there, I think we moved to FPAS Mark 2 when we clearly understood that there could be multiple paths. And then life is much more rich and vibrant that we could even think of, given all the geopolitical things around us, all things that are currently happening. That's why we moved to running our business as a risk management exercise when we're contemplating with different scenarios. But it's not, I want to mention that it's not a discretion. Every single scenario has analytical framework behind it. And at the very end, we're telling, with given scenario A or scenario B, we're responsible for the target that we have already set to our public.
Yeah, and if you say an analytical framework, you mean sort of a consistent way of thinking about the world, and perhaps even a formal mathematical model, or multiple models, maybe.
Absolutely, yes. That's perfectly correct.
If I may jump in on this, I think it's really important, the three questions that the governor mentioned, and the overall context of the conversation, which I think you're trying to basically to demystify the policy making, the black box, how is the monetary policy made? Mm-hmm. I think the key thing and the key principle is that the role of the central banks and the monetary policy is to really make sure that the system is anchored, which means that you want to make sure that the inflation, the uncertainty around inflation is never going to make the decisions of economic agents, firms who are making their investment, people who are making their consumption. They have to be sure that the price level, which are they using for their actions, is not too uncertain, right? So, we had the time, you mentioned the collapse of the Soviet Union, and we had the time where inflation was several 1,000% a year, which basically means you enter the store, you see a price, when you actually exit the store, the price changes. We had a similar situation, right? So the role of the central bank is fundamentally to make sure that these things never happen, because this is extremely costly for the economies. This is a friction which you never want to do. Now, the system which we use is basically asking these three questions. And I assure you, Joeri, if you go to the best central banks around the world, most of them, in many of these cases, you will not find the answers to this very simple question. And you don't need to be an economist. Question number one, where is the economy now? Mm-hmm. Which means, what's your assessment in terms of the economy relative to its potential? Is it overheated? Like, for example, right now in the US, everybody is talking about the very hot job market, right? So they think the growth is too hot.
Yeah.
What are the underlying forces? So what are the key factors which are going to, play a role in terms of the next 3 years? In case of US, again, you can think about the elections, migration issues, and all this, because these are going to be very important. And then number three, given all these, what is the central bank's role in stabilizing the economy, making sure that, according to the current place of the economy and what are the key factors driving it. What should we do to make sure that the economy never basically engages into these unstable zones? This is the key thing that the central bank want to do. And these three questions, simple questions, many central banks, you go to all the publications, you cannot find, how they think about this. Now, the question about your question, why do we need forecasting and policy now as a system, which is really an organizational framework internally with the communication framework externally. This is the essence of FPAS. We basically try to communicate the answers to these three questions to the people and the firms. And this is not a mechanical thing, right? For example, and this is the question you asked in terms of, why don't you see, today's inflation? If it's too high, just raise the interest rate. If it's too low, just, why isn't that so simplistic, right?
Yeah, because I think a lot of people think about it like that, like, oh, the central bank will just look at, oh, okay, well, now in Europe, right, inflation maybe still a little bit too high, okay, interest rate up. But and then, it's down, okay, interest rate down. But that's not how it works, right?
Exactly. And the reason that you don't have a machine doing it with these very simple things is because you are always interested in what are the reasons that inflation is high. Because the role of the staff and the board together is to basically come up with a narrative which is consistent with the facts, with the theory of the world that you think is the right one. Okay, and then basically make judgment about future policy. For example, your inflation may be high after the global financial crisis, not after global financial crisis, but after the COVID. Look at the US. Inflation was very high, but there were two competing narratives. Narrative number one, inflation is high because basically there was lots of government spending, so it's huge demand. So this is the question of where is the economy now? So that story says the economy is very hot now. We have a big, demand relative to the potential of the economy. So this is gonna end up with an inflation, which is going to be very hard to tackle. Story number two, same inflation number. No, this is not a demand story; it's a supply story because we know that all supply chains, are it's very hard to bring stuff to the markets, to your houses. It's much more costly. People want more wages because it's not safe to work. And this is basically not a demand story. Now, these two stories have a radically different policy implication. In case of the first story, where you think that it's overheated economy, same inflation number, you want to actually increase the interest rates and signal the markets, as governor mentioned, that the signal for the future as well, that I'm gonna take care of this because I think this is not sustainable. In case number two, you don't say that. You say, no, I don't think this is a fundamental inflation problem because the supply chain problems will go away. So I may as well wait a bit instead of increasing the rates. And this is the trap that Fed has fallen, because I think what their judgment in 2021 August was that most of it is a supply story. So we don't need to raise the interest rates. It turned out that was not the case. So we see that, after, 3 years now, it's still very uncertain how inflation is, going back to the target. So the point is there is lots of this analytical work and asking the right questions with the staff and the board to understand what is the underlying narrative, which is consistent with the facts, because there is always more than one narrative, So that is the reason that it's not so simplistic. To do this complicated stuff, you need a system. This is the forecasting and policy analysis system. Moreover, to communicate this, you also need a system, because if you don't have the consistency, you can forget about communicating it.
And because we're talking about the US, right? And I know a lot of people are aware of inflation in the United States. Did the Federal Reserve have a system in place? And if not, or like if they had, how could that have helped them in this case?
The Fed certainly, they have a system. We have talked a lot in our seminars about this. I think there are things that, in my personal opinion, the Fed is doing really well, but I think there are things in terms of communication that could be done much better. And I think and this is where we will go to the prudent risk management approach to monetary policy, or the FPAS Mark II. But I think the key problem number one with the Fed was that and they think this is a fundamental problem with the system because it has to do with the communication. I think they were too focused on one story, which is the inflation is transitory story, rather than genuinely communicating the uncertainty and telling the market that, this is also a possibility, right? So when you do this kind of a communication, what it means that in the future, when you are surprised, it is much more difficult for you to actually do the right thing, because first you have to fight back all your communication, which you have done before, and then do the right thing. Number two, which is very specific to the Fed, and maybe for people are not following professionally, they don't know it, but they have the so-called dot plots.
Yeah.
And the dot plots is basically each member of the who votes on the Fed for the interest rate. They basically, this is anonymous. You don't see the names, and you can see these dots of the interest rates for next several years. So it's what do they think will be the right interest rates. Now, from the
so
first,
you have multiple dots for every member of the.
You have multiple dots. Every member has their dots, but the problem is, and I think this is where the system could be improved, and this is what we have been working on, is that, see, when you just see a dot and you don't see an underlying narrative, you basically just see numbers and you have no idea why does that particular board member think that this is the right path for inflation to go back. So these three questions that we're talking about, it's unclear from these interest rates, how is this going to happen? So this is just a number which can actually confuse you rather than help you, because it is much more optimal in a sense to actually tell the story that you think of, what's the narrative, and then say, this is why I think the interest rate should follow this path. In their case, you basically just see the final point and have no idea who voted for what and what's the underlying narrative. And I think, during the last couple of years, you look at the economic commentary, these dot plots did only worse for the system.
So, okay, yeah. So the Fed did have a system in place, might have been slightly different from yours, and so that meant that they have a consistent way of looking at the world. We know what data they're looking at. They tell us. They have these models. They also tell us, like, we have these models. So this is all, I think, in the service of making them as predictable as possible. That's what you want, right? You want people to think that you are very boring in the sense that they know what you will do, right? Because that helps to make the world a little bit more predictable for the economic actors.
They have to understand the system,
But then sometimes central banks do not have a system at all, making for a lot of confusion. And then some central banks have systems, but you're arguing, well, that system can be improved, right? And I know that both of you are dying to talk about like how that system can be improved. But I just want to talk a little bit first more about still the difference between central banks that don't have a system at all. Like, for example, I know that there has been some criticisms, for example, of the Bank of England for potentially not having that. Or maybe a better example or another example would be central banks like those of Argentina and potentially Turkey. Because these are, I want to stress these cases a little bit, because these are sort of the horror scenarios, well, the Argentina and Turkey ones then, not England, that you guys are fighting very hard to not end up in, right? Because, of course, central banks get a lot of criticism for, making these wrong forecasts. But I think people should not forget that you don't have inflation, like perhaps there is in Turkey, that goes from 60% to 100% back to 60%, like, right? So you've been working very hard. That's why you have these systems, I think, to avoid at least that. And then we can talk about, less extreme problems, like there was during COVID, for example, where a lot of people got very confused by all the central banks because they sort of said, like, oh, well, we think inflation is transitory or going away, like you mentioned. But it ended up being far less transitory, at least, than was communicated. So can you comment a little bit more on the central banks that do not have a system at all, how that works to having a system? And then after that, we can definitely talk about making the system better.
I think I can start with that without going into kind of my deliberations on the colleagues at the central banking community.
Totally.
I think the questions that you raised have multiple facets. So we will have cases where central banks are not politically independent. So rule number one in whole central bank history is that central banks are created by general public to protect them from the instances of high inflation, because governments are there to spend and central banks are there kind of taking the punch bowl during the party. That's what one of the Fed presidents said, right? Mm-hmm. So they're there to take something from their hands without letting them go and getting completely drunk. So that's why society's created central bank to protect them and taking out that noise, which is called inflation, out of the system. So on daily basis, and Armen mentioned that very clearly, so on daily basis, when economic agents make their decisions, they shouldn't be looking at inflation because that shouldn't be a problem for them. So that's why the mandate of independent central bank was created. So in several instances that you mentioned, I think it's not the case, unfortunately. And then the second point is that there is no possibility to overcome sound economic theory based on what you want to achieve. What I mean by that is that if there is a high inflation in the country, there is no help in reducing interest rates. It will make things even worse. And that's what we saw in several countries, including the country that you mentioned, our neighboring Turkey, where they had very high inflation. And the problem of high inflation is that it completely changes the psychology of economic agents. So if you enter the shop and then you see one price in the morning and the other price in the evening, it completely changed the cycle of the people. So they want to consume more because they know that if they don't consume now, it will be more costly for them to consume tomorrow. So that's what we don't want to happen. In that sense, stability and the goal setting and the price or inflation rate that we're saying as our target has that ambition or that phenomenon that we want to have in place, and then to create an environment where people are credibly believing in our policies, right? So now regarding the countries where they do have some frameworks, but those frameworks are those which are not as effective as some would want to see. I think at one point in time, we saw that Bank of England had a fun chart, and Armen would correct me if I'm wrong, but I remember that fun chart shows that the inflation in United Kingdom will come down. But when we were trying to understand how would that happen, there was no story behind it because the interest rate was constant. So how would you expect that with the constant interest rates, the inflation will come down? That was the story that everyone wants to hear, but we didn't hear that.
Wasn't that then the supply chain story?
So it was a transitory story of supply being somehow restricted and it will come back and then that will help. But through narratives, we didn't find it out. So that was not the clear communication part. Because as Armen mentioned before, so there are like two ways. One is demand-driven, the other one is supply-driven. And central banks should be more proactive and vocal if the things are about demand. Mm-hmm. But you need to communicate, and then people need to understand how you think. That's why we thought that implication of FPAS Mark II is not a bad idea at all.
Yeah, so that means, as I see it, and please correct me if I'm wrong, what you're proposing now, so to have a system that is based on this risk management philosophy, and it's based on this scenario analysis, is really a reaction to what we've seen with central banks all over the world, really, that they did have a system in place. So it was clear, like, Just to go back to Turkey, for example, where one governor can come in and they decrease the interest rates, and then the next one comes in, and everybody thinks, okay, well now the interest rate is going up like crazy. That is not having a consistent system. That's not having a system. But a lot of central banks had a system making them predictable, but they got it for a large part wrong, at least in the eyes of the general public, in the sense that they had these very these forecasts which they were very confidently communicating, right? Like, oh, inflation will go this. And as you mentioned, sure, they had this fan around it, right? They had this, they say we're a bit uncertain about, but if you have a fan around the line, everybody will look at the line instead anyway. And then inflation did something completely different. And then now I think the trust in central banks is way lower than before that, right? So can I see this initiative of saying we have to rethink this as a response to that, like confident predictions and then getting it wrong, and then people, saying central banks got it wrong?
Yeah, let me bring another angle to that might be interesting as well. So usually when you have a developed country, the phenomena is that there is this perception that their central banks have high credibility. In our world, we need to fight for it on a daily basis, so it's not given. Mm-hmm. That's why we're treasuring and thinking about credibility very seriously. And then we saw that it's very hard to achieve, but it's very easy to lose. So that's why we're very cautious, and that's why we're struggling day and night just to create that confidence between our relations with our own societies in terms of trust building. So we're trying to build credibility, because credibility is a currency of monetary policy making. So if they don't believe in what you're telling them, then there is no point in doing anything else. So that's why I think being overconfident doesn't help much.
Mm-hmm. So you mean, and I think this gets back to what we talked about in the beginning, right? Like the central bank does more than just setting the interest rate. People have to believe that the central bank will set the interest rate for as long as necessary at a certain level to achieve inflation.
Yes.
And just, I guess, as in life for many people, right? Like I think that's a saying for any person. It's difficult to build trust, but very easy to lose it.
Yeah. So
if I may jump, I'm sorry, go on.
Just one sentence, and I give floor to Armen back. I think it's very hard to make any type of policy, especially monetary policy, because there are interest groups which will be hit by your policy one way or another. Mm-hmm. But what you had in mind and what gives you a courage to go out and to implement policy, which is harsh sometimes, is this understanding that we're serving general public and we're trying to completely eliminate inflation as a problem or as an obstacle.
Yeah, because indeed, like there's huge political pressure, right? If you increase the interest rate, savers will be very happy, but people who just want to buy a new house and get a mortgage will be very pissed. And so there's a ton of political pressure always, which is not as felt as much if you have independence and if you have a system in place, which is always the same.
I just wanted to bring one more point to that, because, as Governor mentioned, in terms of the need of a system, if the institution of a central bank is not independent, even if you have the best, economists in the world, with the best system, with the best models, I assure you inflation is going to be very high in that country. So that's a political problem. And in the institutions, independence is very important. An example is Bank of England. Not many people know, but the Bank of England actually officially became independent only in the 90s. Mm-hmm. I think in 1997. Another important fact, I think a couple of days after Bank of England became independent, inflation expectations were actually down by a couple of percentage points, just on the news of the independence. So this is basically, regardless of the system, independence and political independence of the central bank is really, really important. And both Argentina and Turkey, they have the top-notch economists. Everybody knows these two countries produce top-notch economists.
True. Yeah.
Now,
yeah. Some of the top MIT economists are Turkish. So many great Argentinian economists. Absolutely true. I'm very happy you bring this up because I actually get this this comment sometimes on videos that I make about Argentina, for example. Like so many great economists in Argentina. It's true.
Exactly. So systems are not going to help you if you don't have independence, right? Now, if you have the independence, the question is, how are you going to use this independence in a structured way to optimally achieve the targets, right? So basically, making sure you achieve price stability with the least costs for the society. That's the part where you need a system organizational framework to ask the questions that we're talking about and communicate with the markets. And this is obviously, a much more difficult thing to do. If you don't have any system and you basically have numbers flying around and you don't know how to communicate because it's a trap. You don't have a system. You communicate one thing today, tomorrow, almost certainly you're gonna be surprised, and there is no way that you can actually explain, the errors because. There is a joke between the people who are doing the inflation targeting for a long time, which is that inflation targeting is all about making errors and then explaining why did you make the error, right? Mm-hmm. But I think this is the key thing that you need these simple questions to explain the policy, and this is why you need the system in place because again you have we talked about the Bank of England, right? And the real problem is that the purpose of monetary policy is to make sure you have to bring inflation back to the target with your policy instrument, right? And so you are the stabilizer of the system. But if your message to the market is that inflation problem is going to be solved anyway, regardless of my actions, that's exact opposite of the monetary policy framework, right? And you have surprisingly many countries which actually work in that way.
Yeah, I think another example that I thought was interesting that I read about because Bernanke is doing a review of the Bank of England framework, I think. And there I read that one problem that the Bank of England ran into during this whole COVID era is that they based some of their forecasts based of their own interest rate based on market expectations of interest rates. And then because the markets expected that they would decrease interest rates, but they didn't want to decrease interest rates, they projected a huge recession in the UK. And then that didn't happen. And then they said, yeah, we only did that because the market expectations were that the rates would go down. And we just wanted to make clear that we didn't want to bring down the rates. So we made this communication that we didn't actually believe in because we wanted to achieve a certain outcome, which is something you want to avoid at all times, right? You want to tell what you actually believe. Is that a good example?
True. It's a good example because governor brought an example where you keep the interest rate constant, but having the market interest rates is is another example as you mentioned. Now it is not wrong to refer to the market interest rate, which we do as well, because it's an important factor to look at. So it's important to see what do markets believe. But your judgment, you have to explain yourself relative to the market expectations, and that's the key thing. So market expectations are okay as long as you can basically bring your own narrative, and situate your own narrative around the market expectations. I think this is the key thing. But because you brought up Bernanke and the review, I think I was looking at the commentary on this overall, and I think I see a big problem there, and I think this would be a good segue also to the risk management approach. And the problem is that people think of good policy and good forecasting as the same thing.
Okay.
So whatever I see the commenter in the Bank of England, somehow, seems to me that the problem is that they somehow didn't forecast things well, which is not the case in terms of the, real root problem in the world of the central banking. You can, be bad at forecasting because, natural shocks happen, right? But you may still have good decisions and good policy. So I think this, making it, it's a big error to give an impression that good policy somehow is achieved by the central banks which are good at forecasting because they have, fancier models or fancier IT. This is the complete, wrong way, in my opinion, to think about policy, because forecasting or models is just an input to the decision making. It's basically, to get the tasty soup, you need all these ingredients, and the forecasting and the it's only one very small part. And we will talk about this when we discuss about the risk management, because in an uncertain world, I assure you, there is no board of the central bank, which believes in one line and says, so this is what's going to happen. This is not how people, make decisions in real life.
So I think I read about this, this is related in one IMF paper about the first FPAS or which basically said, if you look at forecasting, which as you mentioned is a crucial part of your system. It's a part of your system. It's not the system. It's part of your system. A good forecast doesn't, if it doesn't happen, doesn't mean that the forecast was not good, because you have your economy, which you believe operates in a certain way. And then you have these shocks, as you mentioned. So that is stuff that's very, very difficult to predict. It's already in the word, it's a shock, right? So let's say Russia invades Ukraine. And then as a consequence, you have these huge oil and gas price increases and food price increases. Now that's unexpected for central bankers. But let's say then a central bank in Europe forecasts inflation will come down, but it doesn't come down because of this shock. Then the forecast was still correct, given that given that the central banker has always been clear that they didn't know about this shock, right?
Yeah, I think so. In fact, we are now, I'm being a bit too geeky here, but the word that we use is usually projection rather than forecast. And the reason that we use word projection, in the first, in the last, 15 years or 17 years that we have doing the FPAS Mark 1, we were using the word projection. And the reason is that these projections, right, is just one scenario under very specific circumstances. For example, as you mentioned, that there is no big conflict in the center of Europe. Obviously, it's very hard to predict that kind of thing, right? So there's just one narrative, okay, no more. It's just one narrative which you use as a communication tool to tell the people what would you do if this particular circumstances would happen, right? So this is not about the likelihood of the things, right? This is the key thing. It's just basically about the consistent narrative, okay? Obviously, you have to give a projection which is relevant, which can be relatable to people. It cannot be from the outlandish assumptions. It should be something which is realistic, but it's just one line, and you cannot put all your eggs in one basket and say, oh, this is the one projection that this is true. And yes, you're absolutely right. There can be many things that can be it can go wrong. Shocks may happen. Second thing, your knowledge about the economy is not ideal. You may think that things work in one way, not necessarily the true. For example, when you have big shocks, people actually behave in a different way compared to when you have small shocks, right? So this is to the point of the nonlinearity. If there is a high uncertainty, people, behave in different ways. So you can be wrong in terms of your assumption, in terms of how the world works. There are many ways that things can go wrong. So the real question, and this is how we wanted to ask to design the system, is given all these potential problems, how do you design a bulletproof system that you make a right decision? You know that these problems are there, but how do you design a bulletproof system which can work robustly, irrespective of these problems?
Yeah, and now I think we finally get
and segue to FPAS Mark 2, because I think that what we
exactly.
want to ask, right? So I'll give a couple of ideas, and then let's explore more. I think one real life example for us was Russia-Ukraine. Because Armenia is very interconnected to Russia in terms of economic developments. Imagine that it's February 2022 and it's February 26, and Central Bank of Armenia's board needs to make a decision on interest rates. And then there is a news out, and we know that there will be an extremely negative shock coming from Russia, and our economy will be hit hard. Imagine that we're in a system that we need to draw a baseline, the most probable one. That would be it, right? But if you have this case A versus KB type of thing, there was also an idea in the boardroom that what if Russians start exodus from Russia and moving to Armenia? Engineers, IT guys. And that would not only hit Armenia, but it would have a positive impact on Armenian economy. And then if you are going out and telling these two stories, that is very important. So people would understand why you are holding the interest rate steady instead of decreasing the interest rates because there is an adverse shock coming, right? So this gives you a possibility somehow to be more transparent and to tell both sides of the story, which would be our case A, which is more hawkish compared to the market, because you mentioned the market thing. Case B, which would be more dovish compared to the market. And then from all the universe of case A's, we bring one that tells our narrative, and we also bring something from case B universe to tell that narrative. And that helps economic agents to see how we think. And now it's not the question whether central bank is empowered or tooled enough to make the best forecast in the world, but it's somehow how central bank thinks about the possible developments.
Yeah, so now we of course finally get to the most interesting part, and because as I understand it, you guys are the first to start doing this, right? Have you already started doing this? So that was recently at an interest rate announcement of the European Central Bank, where they still do the old-fashioned way. They said, "Oh well, we expect inflation to go down for this and this reason, or to not go down as fast as we wanted because oil, blah blah blah." Just like one story. But have you already started this, like telling multiple stories?
Yes, we did. I think we did something revolutionary. It's not easy because we're talking to different people, very supportive ideas, somehow kind of cautious ideas as well. So people are very interested in developments. But at the same time, we took a risk. And from January 2024, we just started working with the framework completely.
And now I'm really interested because you mentioned your previous scenarios, 2022 for Armenia. And now since then, I think, if I'm correct, Armenia was negatively affected at first, but then positively affected also partially because a lot of trade sort of diverted potentially via Armenia. So what are your scenarios now for the future of the Armenian economy?
Armen, go ahead.
Yes, so I think to just add some point on the governance point, in 2022, when we were actually at that time publishing the forecasts, before Russia-Ukraine, our forecast for that year was 5.6%. And we marked down our forecast, because it was several days after the, February 24th. We marked down the forecast to I think 1.6%. So we decreased it
for
the
GDP
growth
or for
GDP growth. So to 1.6%, because it was very hard to tell a story that at that point you have to realize the uncertainty was very, very high. That year we had 12.6% growth. So huge forecasting error. But still, as governor mentioned, still in terms of the policy, it didn't necessarily affect the policy, so badly, because we always had in mind these kind of risks, but we didn't have the toolkit to communicate this in the right way at that point. And this is why this is so important. Right now, if you look at what we have right now, it's very important how there's one caveat, because central bank governance are different in different countries. In case of Armenia, we have 8 central bank board members, including governor and 2 deputy governors, and there is no consensus based. It's individual, voted based system.
Okay. And so most votes is what the decision will be on the interest rate.
And if there is a split, governor's vote, wins the split if there is 4-4.
Yeah.
So it's based. That is why in our system, every board member has their own narrative in their mind, right? So the staff gives them the toolkits and illustrative scenarios to think about. But at the end of the day, each board member believes in his or her own story and the scenario. But so I'll give you the 2 narratives that were prevalent, in the last decision meeting, which we, by the way, started to publish attributed minutes, meaning the names of the board members and who said what, because it's important for transparency. But second, it's important for people to understand, why are the people, what are the arguments board members were making, right? And so last year we had, very high growth, around 8.7%, and very low inflation, negative inflation of minus 0.9%. And so the key question is, how consistent is going and sustainable is going to be this, low inflation, high growth environment going forward. And there are basically 2 competing narratives. Narrative number 1 was that, the inflation that we saw, which is very low and in negative territories, our inflation target is 4, but inflation on 12-month basis was minus 0.9. One story is that, the inflation is, if you look at the headline inflation number, it's low because the goods prices around the world have been, going down for a long time. So it's lots of imported, low inflation. Exchange rate in Armenia appreciated for the last 2 years a lot. And so that basically drives the main inflation outcomes.
But you didn't have this energy shock? I just have to ask, as a European.
No, so that's in that sense, Europe is very different because you have basically been exposed to this very negative supply shock, which is the energy shock. In our case, that was not the case. But so what happened? So in this particular one narrative, which is basically the inflationary narrative, or what would be consistent with interest rate higher than the market expects to bring inflation back to the target. In this particular case, the scenario was, what if this low inflation in fact masks lots of underlying hot demand, because growth is 8.7%. So maybe we are just seeing like the temporary low inflation because of these goods prices. But if you look at the services prices, if you look at the sticky things, which are harder to move and which are more demand prone, these prices are still going down very slowly. So in that particular case, you don't want to declare a victory over inflation too soon, because it may be that you start easing too soon and too far, too quickly, and your inflation goes back because these positive effects in terms of the low inflation fade out.
Yeah.
And and the inflation goes back because you have this overheated economy, right? So this is the one scenario. But a second scenario was, and was one part of the board members basically was, thinking that this is something, this is the policy error that they would like to avoid. The second type of a scenario was a bit different, which was that that the inflation is low because we thought that the potential of the economy in Armenia during the last couple of years has gone up, which means that this 8.7% doesn't result in a very, very big overheating. So it's still, because we have a high potential. So most of the growth was actually due to the potential. Second, we had, big labor influx from, in our case, it's from India, because our wages have grown a lot. So we had lots of people from India coming to Armenia for work. So that actually puts a downward pressure on the labor market. So less inflation going forward. So that particular group was saying, no, we don't want to penalize the economy too much, all right, because we don't see the risk of high inflation going forward, right? So these are the two sort of the stylized scenarios that the board was thinking about and navigating through in terms of making a decision, right? So there are two policy errors in this particular case, and there is very high uncertainty, right? Because scenario-based decision making is really important when you have very high uncertainty.
Yeah.
And admittedly, we have very high uncertainty because the growth was very high, inflation was very low. How sustainable it is, both things are very important. So these were the two families of the scenarios which we basically went out and communicated with the markets in a very transparent way, we use these to explain our policy decision, right? And we thought, people actually like, to entertain more than one, scenario to actually understand what are the key problems, because it allowed us to underline what is the key uncertainty that we are facing, so they understand. And the reason this is important, because I think this is very important to mention that, again, going back to scenario-based analysis, Bernanke's review and all that, central banks should not, do scenario-based analysis because they want to avoid the responsibility, because they're afraid of making wrong forecasts. I don't think that's the right way of thinking, and this is certainly what we were doing. But the reason that scenario-based decision-making is, is important, because, this is how in real life people, who are responsible for making decisions in a very uncertain world, this is how they do it in a real life. This is not, and it's our job to transparently communicate to people. It's not because we are afraid of, missing.
Yeah.
And but it's because this is how you make a decision.
Can I, if I try to translate this sort of to the issue that normal people, like non-central bankers, would have, like for example, I have a small business. Now, being a small business owner also has a lot of uncertainty, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So I always have to make a decision, how much money do I keep in the bank, right? Like there's a buffer there. And so I'm thinking about, well, maybe next year is going to be a great year because advertising revenue is going to go up or something, right? The rate for advertising. But maybe it's actually going to be a bad year because, well, I have a personal issue and I can't make as many videos as I would. And so I still then make one decision, that is how high my bank account is going to be, right? So I'm keeping 2,000 euros in the bank. But I tell my wife, maybe in this case, I keep 2,000 euros in the bank because, I entertain the scenario that it's going to be a great year for this reason. And I have the scenario that it's going to be a bad year for this reason. And then at the end of the year, we can have a discussion where it was an even worse year than I expected, but I'm not going to get in trouble because, I communicated both scenarios, and I can say, well, this thing that affected us this year was truly unexpected, and she can also see that. Then hopefully, should I think about it like that?
Yeah, I think it's a very good way of putting it. Is that in that particular case, you can be wrong in two ways, right? You can assume that things are gonna turn up very well, and in that particular case, you are going to be very you basically are not going to be cautious, so you are going to draw down your bank account, invest, and suddenly it turns out that not the case, you are going to be in big trouble. That's one type of an error. Second type of an error is you may be too cautious, obviously, and things can turn up well, and you may lose some opportunity for business growth. And so the question is, you have to make a decision based on your individual preferences, which policy error you are afraid of, right? So, so in case of, for example, in emerging countries, if I now translate your example to inflation, they are usually less tolerant towards higher inflation because they have an inflationary history. And they know that, for example, if you have a low inflation for some time, that's an easier problem to solve than if you have a higher inflation for some time. So in some countries, for example, you would have that particular case. In some countries, no. In case of US, for example, or The low inflation is also a big problem. So, but the point is that yes, fundamentally, if you are driving a car very very fast, and there is a turn, and there is a cliff, yeah, you may be, there is the best way of, getting the turn, right? Without falling, which will, give you the best time if you're racing. But admittedly, you don't want to risk it. So you may actually say, okay, I might slow down a bit more before I get the turn, because I don't want to risk it. I don't want to risk this very, costly possibility of getting the car out of the cliff. So I think this is the kind of thing. So you want to make sure that you think about these both scenarios. And admittedly, during uncertain times, people make decisions, in a scenario-based way.
I'm glad you mentioned the car crash example, because that's the final thing I wanted to talk to both of you about, in the sense that I think we've now discussed sort of, okay, what's systemic thinking, how is it different from, more sort of political way of central banking, and we've discussed like, hey, there's been a problem where central banks have been too confident in what they say the future will be. So maybe just like many businesses would communicate scenarios, a couple of scenarios. So should a central bank should do that as well to get more trust, or to lose trust less is perhaps a better way of putting it. But I think I read also in your report that you could potentially also think about it's called dark corners, or sort of the horror scenarios. And you mentioned that you thought about the A and B, optimistic, pessimistic scenarios. But being Armenia, you've been in a war with Azerbaijan recently, right? You're up north. You have Russia, where all sorts of stuff is going on. In Turkey, all sorts of stuff is going on. In the south, you have Iran. So you have a ton of uncertainty in your area. So are you also thinking about these dark corners, or horror, or very extreme scenarios as well, alongside the normal scenarios?
Yes, we do.
And what are they?
So one of them would be the implication of geopolitical risks. So different kind of whatever you can think of.
So there are many scenarios there.
There are
basically.
many. And then, so from that universe, bringing them into one, which is more plausible. That's the job of the board and the team together to work on that.
And do you also publish these, or not yet, perhaps?
We haven't published any scenario X, as we call it, yet. Yeah, but we're only publishing case A and case B.
And will that change?
I think
it will be need-based. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's one thing that we have discussed internally. I think that will be the next phase of the development.
Yeah, because I sense a little bit of carefulness on your side, which I think also makes sense, in the sense that these are very sensitive issues, right? So you maybe that's the trade-off for you. Like, hey, should we talk about? I can say it, maybe being in the media, and Azerbaijan invading, or should we not talk about it? For example, right? Anything like an extreme scenario like that.
Yep.
Okay, but I'll definitely be keeping an eye out on that. And I thought this was super interesting, and I hope that people take away from it that smaller countries like Armenia are thinking about how can we improve central banking, and there's more need for you to do it, because you still have, as I think Armen mentioned, you still have this memory of super high inflation, which people like me are not used to anymore, even though, I had 10% inflation, but it's still very different from hyperinflation. And you just have much bigger shocks there than being in the center of Europe, for example, right?
Yes, I think this is the very important thing, because small countries, they know how quickly can you lose the credibility, and I noticed you were very surprised when I mentioned that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was a moment we had the 3,000% inflation, that you would enter the store, the price would change because you are not used to it. But for example, in 2014 and 15, when the oil prices went down by a lot, there was a huge exchange rate depreciation. People were actually standing in the line to buy, not durable goods, but basically oils, that kind of things, that because they thought that the prices are going to skyrocket, and there were, shelves were empty in 2014 and 15.
Okay.
So we basically see these kind of situations, less frequently, obviously. We haven't seen this kind of situation, even though the shocks were bigger in last, let's say 5-6 years. But when you see these kind of things, this gives you a very good reason to do everything to avoid this situation. And by the way, I think what COVID showed that even the most advanced countries, they actually are no different. They just needed a bigger shock for that to show up.
Yeah, I had to think about that, because if you talk about empty shelves, of course, I have to think about COVID, but you had it probably in 2014 with oil,
because people
and then
thought that
again
the prices are going. So the people thought that prices are going to skyrocket, so they just wanted to pile up the things at home, so they don't have to buy it. But I think the lesson from the COVID was, even for the advanced countries, that this credibility is not given; it has to be nurtured all the time.
Yeah. So if any central bankers from our bigger countries are watching, go check out your report, FPAS Mark II in technical terms, or scenario-based analysis of monetary policy in perhaps a bit simpler language. And thank you both so much for talking to me. So yes, there you have it, a very complex topic that we hopefully have made a bit simpler in this conversation. And if you want to know more about this new scenario-based approach to central banking, I recommend that you check out this video over here about the implementation of FPAS Mark II in Armenia, or this video over here talking about how Armenia's central bankers are trying to train a new class of economists that work with these frameworks.